University of St. Petersburg, formerly Leningrad, Institute of Archaeology and the Academy of Sciences. He has directed numerous excavations, archaeological excavations, and participated in field projects in Armenia, Syria, Georgia, Egypt, Central Asia, and he's the author of 130 publications, mostly on Near Eastern, Armenian, and Caucasian history and archaeology. And he has authored books and edited books as well. He was the first deputy of the First Republic of Armenia, the deputy prime minister, and he has served as the director of the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography of the Academy of Sciences in Armenia, and he has done most recent excavations in the RNE cave, as you know, and he's actually one of the founders of the oldest shoe and the dress and so on. So we're happy to introduce Dr. Areshian.
Thank you for having me. Today, mostly I am going to try to give you a big picture of what's going on most recently with the Armenian cultural heritage in Turkey. So again, I'm saying it will be a long view because as an anthropological historian and archaeologist, what we do mostly, we look at long-term trends, processes that may start 100, 200 years ago, 5,000 years ago, and very often continue even into the future. So when people are talking that archaeologists are digging, yes, I say we are digging, but we are digging not only in the past, we are also digging in the future of humankind. And these specifically future studies are mostly related to such subjects as environmental studies, environmental change, big issues, such issues as globalization, and ethnic conflict and such aspects. The only thing essentially we are dealing with every single aspect of human activities, but with mostly its artifactual representation, how it is represented in material artifacts, and we are now essentially standing and working at the crossroads of many sciences, doing on one hand linguistics, studying the connections of linguistics, languages to material culture, to such issues as ethnogenesis, ethnic processes, and on the other hand things like nuclear physics, because we are doing mostly of our dating now based on nuclear physics, DNA biology, biochemistry, statistics, computer science. So right now our Kotson Institute of Archaeology at UCLA is the largest archaeological institution in the US. We have more than 60 professors, either part-time teaching or affiliated or full-time working. And we are doing now work in 22 countries. So after my presentation, I will give you an idea specifically about the recently established research program, which is generally the first research program in Armenian studies that connects research with graduate education. All other existing Armenian programs are either with the established chairs or programs at other universities with a big, heavy focus on undergraduate teaching and education. Our focus is exclusively research and mostly related to graduate education, preparing training graduate students, MAs and PhDs. So our program is mostly focused on Armenian material cultural heritage, and from that perspective we are also very much involved in such issues as the issues connected to the cultural heritage of the survivors of the Armenian genocide, of the conditions of the Armenian sites in Turkey, and so on. So without further introduction, let me start with the fact that we are now at a very, very important point, both from the standpoint of current modern Armenian history and the issues related to the genocide. First of all, the biggest achievement of the last 50 years was that the Armenian genocide is not anymore a forgotten genocide. People all over the world know about it. Obviously, there are different approaches, different comments, different treatment of that subject. But before 50 years ago, before 65, essentially practically almost nobody was remembering, and even the older generations, both in Armenia and in the diaspora, especially of the survivors of the Armenian genocide, they avoided even talking about that. So, and we have plenty of evidence of that. So this is a very big event of monumental significance that whether recognized as genocide or not, the Armenian genocide is not anymore a forgotten genocide on the global scale. So with that in mind, we are now coming to the 100th anniversary in 2 years of the Armenian genocide. And I'll tell you what really bothers me very much on our Armenian side. That we, both in Hayastan and in the diaspora, the Armenian thinking about the genocide does not take sufficiently into account the enormous changes of realities around. And those realities are multifaceted. Pretty much those realities were triggered by the collapse of the bipolar global system. Because with the collapse of the Soviet Empire and its satellites, we now have the Republic of Armenia, which pretty much changed also the position of Armenia and of the diaspora, which still cannot be completely figured out, that kind of relationship. There are great attempts, and we expect to do much more in that, with that respect. But also the position of Turkey has changed dramatically. Absolutely dramatically, which essentially is dictated by the fact that Turkey now is not just a satellite of the United States and NATO. Turkey tries to ascertain its, let's say, depending on how we would formulate either dominance or leadership in the region, to become the regional superpower in the Middle East. Other big changes is that if Turkey was in opposition with Russia for centuries, since the 17th century. Now Russia is the greatest Turkish ally. When you drive through all the parts of Western Armenia or modern contemporary Eastern Turkey, what you will see the gendarmerie that used to be armed with American weapons. Now they are all armed with Russian weapons. Russia is a great market for Turkey. They have agreements about military cooperation, so this pretty much changes all our perceptions about alliances, the future, and the developments. But together with that, those changes in Turkey, Turkey has also changed absolutely dramatically. And the events of 2002 can really be called the new Turkish Revolution. And I am not going to evaluate it whether it's good or bad, because it's extremely multifaceted. But a revolution is a revolution, which obviously resulted in a tremendous decline of the power of the military in the social life, in the political life inside the country, and tremendous openness. If you read now Turkish newspapers, there are very few places in the world where there is so much freedom of press, and I am thinking we wish we had such freedom of press in the United States, where the Turkish press now enjoys. Your Turkish press can write absolutely whatever they want. So how do we approach now our issues in all this totally changed, completely changed political, cultural, and historical landscape? What's next? So here I am putting 3 points, and I will be essentially talking about the third point, addressing the issues of restitution, which finally now I think can be addressed from a practical standpoint. But as an introduction, I'll also say a few words about point number 1 and point number 2. Please, can we go back to the previous slide? Thank you. The big issue was that especially historians, both Armenian and Western, who were studying the facts related to the Armenian genocide, they focused very much their efforts on establishing the fact of the genocide. It was more than 50 years of struggle to establish the fact of the genocide. So all these archives, not all, but the majority of archives was looking through. The documents were published. Now it's absolute. The genocide became an established fact. But, and this relates not to the Armenian genocide, but whatever we do in life. When we establish some kind of a fact, both in practical life, whether we want to marry our daughter or sons, or we want to start a business, or we want to have a change in politics, change in presidency, we have a series of facts. We first establish them, and now we need to explain, interpret them, and develop an actionable theory. And with that respect, developing an actionable theory, we are making only the very first step. Only the very first step. Why I'm stressing specifically that aspect of necessity of expanding the academic work on the genocide, it's also because it's closely linked to the second issue, to the prevention of the Armenian genocide. The future genocides, prevention of future genocides. I'll give you a very simple example of what I'm saying. When in the 15th century, Copernicus essentially replaced the Earth-centric, the geocentric system of the solar system and the universe with the helios of Ptolemy coming from the classical times. Because that system, the geocentric system, assumed that the sun and the planets, they all revolved around the Earth. When he established that fact, it took another 150 years until Isaac Newton came forward and theorized that and developed his equations of gravity. So pretty much the work on the theoretical understanding of the Armenian genocide, why the genocide happened. We know the fact, but in the big historical picture, why the genocide happened, why it happened the way it happened. It's the work that is only starting. And by the way, in that respect, probably outside of the Armenian audience and outside of foreign audiences who had to be told about the Armenian genocide, Richard Hovhannisyan's single most important thought on the Armenian genocide was to ask one question. Was the Armenian genocide a result of a short-term policy of the Young Turks, premeditated policy of the Young Turks that essentially wanted to get rid of Armenians because they were in crisis, or it was a result of long-term developing trends in Turkish history? Essentially, that question is not answered yet academically. I have my own view on that. Maybe one day I will give a talk on that subject, but this is exactly why I'm stressing that the fact of the understanding why the genocide happened and why it happened the way it happened, this work is still is on the table that needs to be done. This is an enormous range there of questions of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary study of the Armenian genocide, starting from issues of psychological studies, studies of the big picture of history of empires, and so on and so forth. Why I am stressing the importance of that kind of studies? It is because there is a big misconception, especially among the Armenians, that if we are going to remember the genocide, we will be able to prevent future genocides. It's an absolutely unscientific thinking, because it's like giving a pill if somebody has some kind of a pain, but not treating the disease. And look what's going on in Azerbaijan. Because we never explained these big global socio-political issues related to the genocide, there is a whole party in Azerbaijan that says, oh, okay, the Turks didn't finish the Armenians in that genocide, now a new Armenian genocide needs to be started. And essentially, unless, and there are multiple theories, sociological, anthropological, unless we bring together that kind of a discourse based on a global views of history, society, humanity, and human values, just by remembering the genocide, we will do nothing in order to prevent the possibility of future genocides. So this is about the first 2 points that I wanted to make, and now I'm going to address the other aspect, the aspect of restitution. What was extremely important by that consequence of the establishment of the artifact of the Armenian genocide is that now we can work in all these different directions. We can work on the theoretical interpretation, on the explanation of why the genocide. We can work more solidly on prevention of future genocides, and we can work on restitution, on issues of restitution. It's not necessary that we need to wait, oh, okay, let's do now theory for 50 years, then do something on the other question. No, all these 3 aspects, whether it is theory, whether it's prevention, or whether it's restitution, they are all things that we now can start actionable projects. So, with regard to what can we say about the aspects of the restitution? The idea of restitution was all the time since 1915. But now it needs to be addressed very, very specifically. It's the issue of restitution of the properties of the Armenian Church. It's the issues of the restitution of all the properties of those survivors who essentially, to some extent, would be possible to demonstrate their losses. It can be also discussed the issue of some kind of territorial restitution, but that's the most difficult aspect, because essentially that could have been discussed maybe 50 years ago. Now how to approach it is a very difficult question, and on what scale to approach it. On what scale to approach it, because obviously when we are looking at today's map, the historical Armenia does not belong anymore to Turkey. So it's practically in the hands of the Kurds. So all these issues need to be now addressed, but I am going to address to an issue of restitution that in all this sphere to me is probably the single most important issue. It's the issue of ascertaining our Armenian presence across Anatolia. It's the issue of the Armenian cultural heritage. Because that what will be sustaining the Armenian identity, that what will be sustaining the diaspora, that is what is going to essentially changing, if we can achieve something with regard to our cultural heritage, it will be changing the attitude of people in Turkey toward Armenians and Armenia. So here we see the remains of the central part of the city of Van. It's my photo of 2007 from the citadel, and you even can see the remains of all the buildings. In Van we had 13 churches and there were 6 mosques. Some of the mosques you can see on the right were restored. Obviously nobody has even touched the remains of churches. But here I want to bring up to your attention another very important aspect of the study of material culture that either is preserved by the survivors of the Armenian genocide or still exists there. Because the factual study of archives related to the Armenian genocide by now is maybe 60–70% exhausted. The finds are found, documents are published, and with all those things we still don't know many things. We have these wildest discrepancies between the calculation of numbers of the Armenian victims of the genocide. That range from the estimate of the secret book report of Talat from 943,000 to the estimate of the Armenian Patriarchy of about 1.4 million, which is mostly based on church records, to even higher estimates. So if one day, and this is obviously in the future, and I will also talk about what we can do right now. If one day in the future we can really go and do this very detailed archaeological exploration of all these abandoned Armenian villages and towns, we will have a much better estimate of those numbers. And obviously the idea is not only about those numbers. The idea is that the issue is that we know very little about the Armenian genocide on the local level. What we have like maybe less than 100 of really very well written memoirs that document the process of the genocide. But excuse me, this 100 or 200 memoirs written by our eyewitnesses on one hand, on the other hand, 1 million of people. So we probably don't know much more than we know. This is exactly where archaeology is going to play a very, very important role. Now let's go back to the big picture to understand how the issues of the Armenian genocide relate to the big trends in Turkey, in the regional situation, in Turkish history. I am not very excited when our historians talk about the Ottomans all the time, because it's pretty much a substantial distortion of the picture, of the real picture. The reality is that how we look at the big periods of chronology. And when we are talking about the Ottomans as such, with their social order, social institutions, with their policies, with how the empire was organized, we have very good dates for the beginning and the end. And the beginning, it will be the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The end will be in 1804. The date of the beginning of the Serb national rebellion that essentially triggered the whole enormous process of changes inside the Ottoman Empire, so-called modernization, later the Tanzimat reforms, and it triggered all these national movements among the minorities of the Ottoman Empire. So the period from 1804 to 1922. Next slide, please. To 1922 is this transitional period when the Ottoman Empire was not more an Ottoman Empire, but it tried to reconstruct itself, rebuild itself on the model of the worst empires that existed at that time, which were the European colonial empires. We had many other different models of empires in world history, especially in Iran, in the Eurasian steppes, in Central Asia, but the Ottomans essentially decided to adopt the European model of imperialism. And when we are coming back to archaeology, I love to make this big, enormous contrast. Enormous. When you go to the former Imperial Archaeological Museum, Ottoman Museum in Istanbul, and compare it to the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations in Ankara. It's so different. It reflects this total contrast and conflict between the Ottoman ideology and the Young Turks / Kemalist and subsequent ideologies. The concept behind the Ottoman Imperial Museum in Istanbul was very much patterned on Germany, and German architects built the building. It was patterned on the big museums like the British Museum, like the Louvre, and they were collecting everything, next slide please, from the whole empire, Ottoman Empire, like these glazed reliefs from Babylon, which are very rarely cited because everybody thinks about the German collections in Berlin, but when Koldebe excavated in Babylon, the representatives of the Sultan went there and they were picking some parts of that collection. Or they were going to Egypt. And so this was a very broad attempt to represent very broadly the cultures of different periods and epochs of all the territories and countries within the Ottoman Empire. And today, if you go to Istanbul, if you go step into Hagia Sophia, you will see different cultural relics, especially brought under Mahmud IV to Hagia Sophia, belonging to the classical period, classical civilization. Or you can see the Carpet Museum, which part of the collections were also started in the Ottoman period before that. And you will see all these if you go to Dolmabahce to see that wonderful collection of Armenian paintings, that they say that they're Armenian, now they say, they used not to say that. So you will see that Ottoman spirit of looking at the Ottoman Empire as a multi-ethnic and multicultural, this enormous territory, enormous multicultural empire. Next, please. 1922, Sultan Vahideddin is exiled by Atatürk to Malta and ends his days in San Remo in Italy. Lives together with his family. Next, please. And the Ottoman period completely and formally ends. Practically, although as I said, it started ending in 1804, but this the great multicultural Ottoman tradition, they essentially completely collapsed after the Berlin Congress in 1878, which resulted already after that in the massacres, Armenian massacres in Adana and other repressions that eventually ended up in the Armenian genocide. But when Atatürk took over power, one of his essential goals, very, very important goals, was to destroy the memory about the Ottoman past. And here it was a very interesting combination of ideology and policies. Because the Young Turks, they tried to preserve the Ottoman Empire but through homogenization, through conversion of non-Islamic population, through Turkification. So, and they failed because it was impossible. No empire in world history on such a broad, with such a broad ethnic and cultural basis was ever preserved or created by those means. It never happened, and that's why also the Young Turks, as we know, they miserably failed in the First World War. Atatürk preserved their ideology. He changed his policies because the policy was now directed exclusively to the territory of Turkey that he controlled, but he pretty much preserved their ideology. The ideology of Turkification. And that's exactly one of the first steps that he did, was the direct instruction to the people who were in his surrounding to completely revise Turkish history. And this is a very interesting photograph of 1927-28 with Atatürk in the center, and on the far right it's Hamid Zubair Koshak. He is a very influential personal secretary, and after literally a few years, after the establishment of the Turkish Republic in 27-28, Atatürk gave a straight directive to his one of his most important assistants, telling him that now Turkish Republic is established, and his main assignment will do to demonstrate the Anatolian roots and traditions of the Turkish population and in the Turkish Republic. So what he did, and I don't know if it's ever been published or not, what I'm going to tell you right now, because it's from my personal relationship and contacts with our German colleagues, Professor Harald Hauptmann, who was a long-term director of the German Archaeological Institute in Turkey, and good friend of Kurt Bittel, the head of the German excavations at the Hittite capital of the Hittite Empire, Hattushash Boğazköy. One day, Bittel says, Ghazi, suddenly they saw the car of Ghazi coming from Ankara for a 2-day trip to Boğazköy, to the German excavations that were just resumed. And together with Atatürk brought with him Hamid Koşay. Hamid Koşay was, by the way, a very highly educated person. He was a Tatar from Russia, educated in St. Petersburg, who migrated during the First World War to Turkey. So Atatürk comes out of his car, goes straight, has lunch with Kurt Bittel, and he says in German, he was very quite fluent in German, Herr Bittel, one of the most important goals of the Turkish Republic is now to have Turkish archaeologists on the ground, so that Turkish archaeologists may demonstrate the indigenous roots of the Turkish civilization in Anatolia. So that's I am literally telling you from that hearsay. And he said, Herr Bittel, can you show us a site that the first Turkish archaeologist, and he totally disregarded Atatürk, the existence of quite good archaeologists in the 1880s, 1890s, Turkish archaeologists in the Ottoman Empire, such as the Hamdi Bey, the founder of the Ottoman Archaeological Museum. To Atatürk, they simply did not exist because they had a different vision of multiculturalism, so they had to be forgotten. And essentially he asked Herr Bittel, can you show us an archaeological site that my assistant, whom I today relieve from his position of assistant, Dr. Koşay, who will be from now the leader of Turkish archaeology. And Bittel took Hamid Koşay to Alacahuyuk, and from 31, Koşay started excavating these amazing archaeological remains, Hittite archaeological remains in Alacahuyuk. So this was only one of the aspects. The other thing, very important to what was happening to the Armenian cultural heritage and to the future of Turkey, was the introduction of the new alphabet. In 1928, Atatürk spent months and months on campaigning for the elimination of the Ottoman Turkish script. And this is exactly another photo showing how he explains the new Turkish alphabet to people in Kayseri. Next, please. So the result was that Turks completely lost their historical right. Turkish history was completely rewritten. There were some great conquerors sultans, such as Mehmed Fatih, Süleyman Kanuni, a bunch of others that were cherry-picked according to the specific ideology of the powerful Turkic military and inserted in the Turkish history. The rest of the Ottoman history, with its amazing multicultural heritage, was completely eliminated. The textbooks that were created under Atatürk, and mostly, no, Atatürk didn't see, but mostly under İsmet İnönü, those textbooks completely forgot about Ottoman period, was totally rewritten, and it was pretty much a new creation and imaginary history, the way Turkish nationalists, the successors of Atatürk, wanted to see that history. And even if you look as a contrast to the building of the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations in Ankara, you will see this enormous contrast in architecture with the Imperial Ottoman Museum in Istanbul. Because this is something that was coming out of the early roots of local Anatolian architecture. And now if you go to this museum that talks all the time about his historical heritage, it comes through the classical period of the Greco-Roman civilization, which also now tries, although they don't claim that it's ethnically Turkish, but also they try to represent that because it's Turkish territory, it should belong to Turkey. And that's why the whole this new story around Troy and the claims of the Turkish Ministry of Culture about the repatriation of Trojan antiquities and to Turkey. But that's where Turkish history, except for Istanbul, they were not able to eliminate the Ottoman heritage in Istanbul. Except for Istanbul, the Ottoman legacy disappeared. It's gone. Next, please. The most recent project that resulted in a great destruction of cultural heritage was the Ilisu Dam. That in 2007, when I was there, it was still in construction. Now we see it already completely flooded. It's a lake. It's that big series of lakes built on the Euphrates, on the Tigris, and on the Jorokh River. And it was built for different reasons. First of all, strategic military reasons, obviously, but also it submerged a lot of Kurdish occupied towns and villages, and it submerged an enormous quantity of important monuments and sites. And by that I mean of all times and all ranks. On the previous slide we saw the Seljuk bridge submerged, and this shows actually quite nice Ottoman mosque also submerged under the water of the Ilisu reservoir. So it's still the continuation of that policy of destroying that long-term history and keeping people in ignorance and making them reading the history that was written in the 40s, 50s, and all the way through the 70s, 80s. And even if you look at the encyclopedia of Turkish civilization that was published in an history in 10 volumes. Very nationalistic. We received it at UCLA and nobody was reading it, so it was taken off the reference shelves. But that trend essentially continued all the way into the 1990s. Next, please. And this is one of the relatively most recent presentations or reflections of that trend. One of the world's absolutely best museums of Roman mosaics. Built in Aintab, Gaziantep. Aintab. On the again in connection to the building of those big dams on the Euphrates. The big Roman city of Zugmo was flooded. Excavations was carried out from '94. And this is probably, if you want to teach students about good projects in both preservation of cultural heritage and research. This is one of the best projects that can be taught anywhere in the world. There are no comparable quality and levels museums of Roman mosaics, even in Italy. And they did that in a very short period of time. 94 was the beginning of the excavations. It was all published, all restored, and today we have that wonderful museum. But this again talks about like remote antiquity. Next please. Another case, the Malatya Archaeological Museum, where we were in September, and I had there quite an interesting adventure. So this is an archaeological museum that mostly shows the ancient periods of Malatya, and we were not allowed to take photographs there. But it also stops before the Ottoman period. Nothing Ottoman, absolutely, and later. So I like to stick my nose in places where I'm not probably supposed very often to stick. And as an archaeologist, I like to sniff around, so I walked around the museum into the backyard, which is a relatively close encircled place. And what I see there at least 3 or 4 dozens of Armenian inscriptions, beautifully preserved and stacked one on top of another. I tried to take a picture. At that moment, one of members of our group, Bruce Hector, is running to me and says, Gregory, the police is coming. So, because it was a absolutely forbidden place. So, I had to leave without those very interesting photos. Next please. But what I'm all saying about is about this picture. And the big picture is that the Armenian cultural heritage suffered because of for 2 main big reasons. First of all, because it was a part of that multicultural Anatolian heritage of most of the Ottoman period. And Ottoman period was like a boo-boo to the young Turks and to the Turkish nationalists under Kemal and later. And the second thing is that obviously the Turkish governments were simply afraid that this is the material evidence of the Armenian presence in Turkey, in Anatolia. All the way, and by that, with regard to the Armenian cultural heritage, I never want to differentiate between, let's say, Western Armenia, when we are talking Van Kharbet and Malatya, or when we are talking about like Anatolia as Anatolia, like Kayseri, like Kütahya, or Trabzon, which by the way was very close to the historical Armenian territories but was never part of historic Armenia. So Armenian cultural heritage is there everywhere. And this is the part of the evidence of the Armenian presence. The part of the evidence that regardless of political changes, regardless how individual like fortunes of Armenians or Turks or others will develop, that legacy, that heritage is still there. A number of big churches, you will see a couple of them. Yeah, they were destroyed, damaged, but most of the Armenian material culture, material legacy is still there in Turkey, and that's why this now should and can become one of the single most, if not the single one, the most important aspects of restitution related to the Armenian genocide. So, when we are talking about destruction, Now I'm going to a little bit make all of us sad, but then I'm going to end up on a higher note. So prepare please for this wave of brief sadness, because I will talk about proactive things at the end. There were three essentially aspects, policies that resulted in the destruction of the Armenian cultural heritage, both in Western Armenia and across Anatolia. One was, the most innocent one was the conversion of Armenian churches. That is a purely religious aspect, at least it rarely resulted in physical damage and physical destruction. We know of such things done by many religions toward one another. Next, please. This is the last major Armenian church conversion, the conversion of the Cathedral of Kars. It happened in 1994. So it's quite well maintained. Sometimes they will let you in and to go and take pictures. I took nice pictures in 2007. Last year we were not so fortunate, but this is the the easy case. This is the easier reversible case, at least in the more distant future. The next aspect is when there is a deliberate negligence toward important cultural sites. And the monastery of Oromos, not far from Ani, which was the resting place of the tombs, the mausoleums of Bagratuni kings, was subjected to such a negligence. This is the picture from the times of the excavations of Nicholas Marr in 1900, and next is the current condition of that monastery. Next, please. This is probably one of the most important monuments of Armenian history, archaeology, art, and architecture. The Cathedral of Tekor, which for me is probably one of the most important, greatest losses that the Armenian cultural heritage suffered. It was very much in discussion for the last 130 years in global international scholarship, because it was supposed that this should have been the first domed church in Armenia, since there are questions about the initial form shape of the cathedral in Echmiadzin, but this was certainly the first documented of the 5th century. Next, please. And as a historian, for me, this was a very, very important site, because this had the first dated Armenian inscription of 480, or the 5th century, naming Hovan Mandakuni, one of the great Armenian patriarchs, Catholicos, who consecrated the church. So now it's gone. We have only a copy at the National Museum of History in Yerevan. Next, please. This is how the Cathedral of Tekor looked after the earthquake of 1912. And now the most shocking. Next, please. This is how it looks today. So essentially, what happened? First, it was allowed to be deteriorated, completely subjected to negligence, and then the locals were encouraged to take stones for their building and their construction. This is the view of when the Italians were working there in 1970s. Next, please. This is another horrible case of destruction. a very important cathedral of Bagavan on the left. Why it is important? Because it's on the upper Aratsani, upper Euphrates River, where at Bagavan, Gregory the Illuminator baptized Tiridates III and his host. And on that place, at the beginning of the 7th century, this cathedral was built. Architecturally, it is very interesting because it has the plan very typically developed in Armenian early medieval, or depending how we call it, maybe we can call it late antiquity or early medieval, depending how we treat that period from the 3rd to the 7th century. But it has this very typical Armenian plan, but at the same time it essentially very much imitates, its dome imitates the Hagia Sophia of Justinian in Constantinople. And on the right is all what remains of the Bagavan Cathedral, what remained by the early 90s. Next, please. This is the strongest evidence of the worst case scenario, because it is documented how the military explosive squad, obviously directed from Ankara, came to Khatskon and they blew up with explosives that monastery. So you can see there are 5 churches. Next, please. And today this is the only Subsarkis, St. Sergius church that is still standing. It's was one of the most beautiful and best monasteries of the Ani Bagratuni period, built from the 10th, 11th, and partially all the way to the 13th century, but mostly 10th and 11th. Next, please. So, if we go to the west, to Van, these are the pictures of the beginning of the 20th century from Baragavank, the holy see of the Archbishop of Vaspurakan. Next, please. This is the view of 1906, and now you will see the same place in the mid of 1980s and how it looks today on the next slide. You see the same arches, and the cathedral completely disappeared. Next. And this is another case, also related to the Bagratuni period, the castle of Tignis. This photograph is from Varuj's archive, who was a photographer at Mars excavations, how it looks at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. Also absolutely clear, blown up with a lot of explosives, because simply it had like 8 to 10 feet thick concrete walls. And now you can see what remains of those concrete walls. That's all what remains of that. Next, please. Now I'm going a little bit to change my talk and try to uplift your mood a little bit by this only light at the end of the tunnel. We don't know today whether we are going to reach that end of the tunnel and whether the light will be still there or not when we reach the end of the tunnel, but at least we can do something about it. As I said in the beginning, these external processes that happened on the global scale had tremendous impact on the internal developments in Turkey. And it was essentially the decline in the importance of the military that allowed the party of the current Prime Minister Erdogan, party coming mostly from Istanbul, to take over the government and started making really big changes. And I deliberately don't say where those changes will take at the end. Turkey and Armenia and the region, but the scale of the changes is obviously there, and it's absolutely amazing. Best freeways are built. Now in Turkey you have freeways much better than in California. businesses are booming, banks are growing, and very recently the Central Bank of Turkey was moved from Ankara to Istanbul, and Erdogan is now building for him a central office also in Istanbul. So we'll see where all those changes will take us, but there is one absolutely clear prospect. If Turkey is going to become a superpower in the Middle East, it won't be able to establish its superiority by military means. Now it's absolutely so. They will have to become dominant economically and even maybe culturally. Because if you go and talk to people in Istanbul, all the talk is going about multiculturalism. Now, it's not what people in Ankara like to hear. Absolutely not. And there are backlashes coming out from Ankara. Especially, we got subjected to a very fierce attack. By that I mean the archaeologists, Western archaeologists, by the Ministry of Culture of Ankara. So that's why I'm not talking about like Armenians and Turks now anymore, because it's a big transitional period. So we need to be more precise and exact. Talk and see who is who. Because in the last 3 years, more than half of all the foreign institutes, French, German, American, were either severely limited or completely expelled from Turkey. For example, I'm talking about my institute, our institute. We were forced to shut down our project near Ankara at Gordian, where we were studying the natural environment, reconstructing natural environment of the Phrygian period, first half of the first and middle of the first millennium BC. It seems that that kind of research must be welcomed by the Turkish government, because we are telling them, helping them to understand where their natural environment is going. But no, they didn't want us. The German Archaeological Institute that has done the work in Boğazköy for more than 100 years now lost its license to excavate. Another historically German project from 1870s at Troy now is being transferred to the Çanakkale University and so on. So it was like a massive attack from the Ministry of Culture of Turkey. Why I don't want to mix them with Turkish archaeologists, because Turkish archaeologists are now en masse coming to us with complaints because they lost our intellectual support, they lost the possibility of using our technologies, our labs. In many cases, they lost the Western funding. The American Institute of Turkey, under the new director that works for about 2 years, took absolutely drastic measures. They deliberately shut down themselves all the work that depended on the Ministry of Culture of Turkey. And now they are mostly working on projects of the preservation and conservation of cultural heritage, of issues of multiculturalism. And they have Armenian visitors who study there. They are partially sponsored with grants from the Ding Foundation right now, and they are focusing very much on these issues of Ottoman history and trying to correct this Turkish interpretation of history of the 20th century. So we'll see how long they can work there, but they have an extremely strong support among the Turkish intellectuals in major universities in Istanbul. At Koç University, Bilgi University, Sabancı University, they all collaborate with them. At UCLA, for example, I was absolutely amazed. I never thought that we will see like 6, 7 Turkish professors and grad students coming on different occasions in the last 18 months and talking openly about the Armenian genocide. But it's all the part that is from Istanbul. So there will be big issues. Now, where it's going to go, I don't know. When I was preparing to give this talk, that was the situation. Now on the ground, things changed so fast that about 6 weeks ago, Erdogan fired that Minister of Culture who was anti-Western. But the Director of Antiquities, the Deputy Minister of Culture, who was essentially preventing all the Western scholars to work, he's still there. So we will see what that new Minister of Culture will do. But the important thing is, I think that now we can actively participate to the happenings there. We can raise all these issues about multiculturalism and the Armenian cultural heritage, especially in the environment of these liberal universities in Istanbul. Next, please. We see also this some kind of evolution. We will go just briefly on other sites. With other sites, what's going on? That clearly is evidenced and has impact even on the Armenian sites. First of all, the deliberate destruction of Armenian sites that lasted for about 80 years, it totally stopped. Second, there are some shifts. And honestly, I'm very still cautious about all these things. The island of Ahtamar, with the famous church, when I first visited it, it was all still carrying the wounds of from the late 1917, when it was left by the Russian army, with traces of shooting on the reliefs of Adam and Eve in an extremely dirty situation. In 2003, when I went there, they were beginning the restoration. Next, please. After the restoration, this is my next visit already in 2007, the restoration of the church was completed. We can, it's about it was done at, I would say, at an acceptable level, the architectural part. The restoration of frescoes inside is really magnificent. But essentially you can notice that there was no cross on top of Ahtamar. Now when we went last year, please, there is a cross on top of Ahtamar. Let's continue. And this is one of the restored frescoes done with the absolutely best available today methods. Next. Now let's talk about the big kahuna, Ani. Ani, which is the absolute ultimate expression of the Armenian spirit, the pinnacle of Armenian civilization and Armenian identity. And I'm going to say a couple of words about that as well. The developments in Ani actually are also very interesting and ambivalent right now. First, there is a very good protection of the site. No doubt about that. Maybe it's done also for political reasons, because when tourists, including ourselves, we are going there, the guides are showing the other side of Ahurian River, where is still located about 20% or 25% of Ani. The population of the working classes that were servicing the center of the capital mostly lived on the other side of Ahurian and were commuting through the bridge.